If someone knocks on your door late at night, you usually assume it's something normal. A neighbor needing help, a package delivered to the wrong house, someone who locked themselves out. But there's a moment right before you open the door where your instincts tell you something isn't right. 3 months ago, a man named Ethan Miller called the police from his home in northern Pennsylvania. He told them his neighbor had just knocked on his door. The problem was that neighbor had been buried 6 days earlier. The police assumed Ethan was confused, maybe drunk, maybe grieving. But when officers checked Ethan's porch camera footage later that night, they saw someone standing outside his door. A tall man, wearing a familiar jacket, the same jacket Ethan's neighbor had been buried in. And just before the video cuts out, the man outside the door slowly leans closer to the camera and whispers something investigators couldn't explain, because the voice in the recording sounded exactly like Ethan's. If you're new here, turn off the lights, put your headphones on, and let me tell you what really happened the night my neighbor came back. Before we begin, if you enjoy slow burn horror stories that feel disturbingly real, stories about strange encounters that could happen in quiet neighborhoods just like yours, make sure you're subscribed. Most people who listen to these stories late at night aren't subscribed yet. And if that's you, you might want to fix that, because I upload new realistic horror stories every week. Now, let's go back to October 3rd. A quiet street, a house next door, and the first knock. The first thing you need to understand about my neighborhood is that nothing ever happens here. It's the kind of street where people forget to lock their doors. Kids leave their bikes in the yard overnight. Neighbors wave when they drive past. The loudest thing you usually hear after midnight is the wind pushing through the maple trees. My house sits near the end of the block, small 2-story place with a narrow driveway and a front porch that creaks whenever someone steps on it. And right next to me lived Mr. Daniel Whitaker. He had been my neighbor for almost 4 years, retired mechanic, late 60s, quiet guy, but friendly. Every morning around 7, he'd walk down his driveway with a mug of coffee and stand by the mailbox for a few minutes before the mail truck arrived. We'd talk sometimes, weather, football, neighborhood stuff, nothing complicated, just normal neighbor conversations. That's why what happened the week before felt strange, because on a Tuesday morning, I woke up to 3 police cars parked outside his house. Paramedics, ambulance lights, neighbors standing quietly on the sidewalk. I walked out onto my porch just as they wheeled him out, covered with a white sheet. Heart attack, that's what people said later, happened sometime during the night. The coroner estimated he'd been gone for several hours before anyone noticed. His daughter came 2 days later, arranged the funeral, cleaned out a few things from the house. By the end of the week, the place next door was empty, dark, quiet. The kind of quiet that only happens when a house loses the person who lived inside it. The funeral was on Saturday, small service, closed casket. Afterward, people gathered at the church parking lot, sharing stories about him. One of the mechanics from his old shop said Whitaker used to fix engines by sound alone, said he could listen to a car for 10 seconds and tell you exactly what was wrong with it. That night, I went home, sat on the couch, and watched television until about midnight. Nothing unusual, just another quiet evening. By the time I went to bed, the house next door was completely dark. No lights, no cars, no movement. Exactly how you'd expect it to look. I fell asleep quickly, and sometime later, I woke up. Not suddenly, not with panic, just that slow, uneasy feeling that something had disturbed the silence. For a few seconds, I lay there, trying to understand what had pulled me out of sleep. Then I heard it. A knock. Soft. 3 taps. Knock. 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 I turned my head toward the digital clock beside my bed. 2:46 a.m. I frowned. No one ever came to my door this late. Another knock came. Same rhythm. 3 taps. Slow. Even. Knock. 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 I sat up in bed. Maybe someone needed help. Maybe a neighbor had locked themselves out. Things happen. But something about the sound felt strange. Too careful. Like whoever was outside wasn't in a hurry. I pulled on a hoodie and walked down the hallway toward the stairs. The house was completely silent. When I reached the living room, I could see the faint glow of the porch light through the curtains. Another knock came. Knock. 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 I stopped a few feet from the door. "Hello?" I called out. No answer. I stepped closer and looked through the small glass panel beside the door. At first, I couldn't see much, just the porch railing, the street light down the road, the dark outline of the empty house next door. Then the figure stepped forward into the porch light, and my stomach dropped. Because standing on my porch was Daniel Whitaker. The same gray jacket he always wore, the same baseball cap, the same tired expression on his face. But there was one thing wrong. Whitaker didn't blink. He just stood there, smiling faintly, waiting for me to open the door. And the last time I had seen him, he was inside a coffin. Maybe someone was messing with me. Some kind of prank. Or maybe Whitaker had a twin brother nobody mentioned. Stranger things have happened. I grabbed my phone from the small table beside the couch and turned on the porch camera app. The live feed appeared on the screen, but the porch was empty. No one standing there, no shadow, nothing. My stomach tightened. I slowly looked back toward the door window. Whitaker was still there, standing exactly where he had been before, the porch light shining directly on his face, but the camera still showed nothing. My hands began to feel cold. I turned the phone slightly so I could see both the screen and the door at the same time. On the screen, empty porch. In front of me, Whitaker. Then, Whitaker leaned closer to the door, slowly. His face moved closer to the glass panel beside the frame, close enough that I could see every wrinkle in his skin, close enough that I could see the faint reflection of the porch light in his eyes. Except, the reflection looked wrong. Instead of the porch light, it looked like a darker place, like something moving behind him, inside his eye. My heart began beating faster. "Who are you?" I whispered. Whitaker didn't answer, but his smile grew slightly wider. And then, for the first time, he spoke. The voice sounded like his, same raspy tone, same slow way of speaking, but the words felt strange, like someone repeating a sentence they had heard once before. "Ethan," he said softly. "My name." Hearing it made my chest tighten. "How did you—" Whitaker raised one finger slowly, pointing, not at me, not at the door, at the house next door, his house, the empty one. Then he said something that made the back of my neck go cold. "They're inside." I frowned. "What?" Whitaker tilted his head slightly. "They're inside the house." The wind outside rustled through the trees. For a moment, the porch light flickered. When the light stabilized again, Whitaker had stepped back from the door, still smiling, still watching me. Then he slowly turned around and walked off the porch toward his house. I rushed to the window beside the door and pulled the curtain aside. Whitaker was crossing the lawn between our houses, moving slowly, almost stiffly. The front door of his house stood dark and silent, no lights, no movement. Whitaker reached the porch steps, climbed them, and then something impossible happened. He didn't open the door, he just kept walking, straight through it, like it wasn't there, and disappeared into the darkness inside the house. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty porch next door, trying to convince myself I had imagined everything. Then, from inside Whitaker's house, I saw a light turn on, and a shadow moved across the living room window. But the house next door was supposed to be empty, and Whitaker was supposed to be dead. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring at the house next door. The living room light inside Whitaker's place was definitely on. Not bright, just a faint yellow glow leaking through the curtains. But it shouldn't have been on at all. The power company had shut off most of the utilities after his daughter left earlier that week. I remembered seeing the service truck outside. And even if the electricity was still working, there shouldn't have been anyone inside. Whitaker had no other family in town, no roommates, no caretakers, just an empty house that had been locked up since the funeral. Yet I had just watched someone walk straight through the front door. My brain kept trying to explain it. Maybe I was mistaken. Maybe Whitaker's daughter had come back unexpectedly. Maybe someone else had a key. Maybe... A movement caught my eye. Something shifted behind the curtain of Whitaker's living room window. Not a full shape, just the shadow of someone passing slowly across the room. I stepped closer to my own window to get a better look. The curtain inside his house moved slightly, and for a brief moment, I saw the outline of a person standing in the center of the room. Tall, still, facing the window, facing me. Even from across the yard, I could tell it was him. The same jacket, the same hat, Whitaker. But something about the way he stood made my stomach tighten. His posture was wrong, too straight. Whitaker had always walked with a slight slouch, the kind mechanics get after years of leaning over engines. But the figure in the window stood perfectly upright, like a mannequin. I leaned closer to the glass. "Mr. Whitaker?" I said quietly. Of course, he couldn't hear me, but the figure inside the house reacted. Its head tilted slightly to the side, like it had heard something. My throat tightened. Then the curtain shifted again. The figure stepped closer to the window, and the light inside the house flickered, just once. When the light came back on, Whitaker's face was pressed against the glass. I jumped back from my own window. My heart was pounding now. Even from this distance, I could see his eyes clearly, wide open, completely still. That same strange smile stretched across his face. And then he did something that made my chest tighten. He raised his hand slowly, and waved. Not the casual wave neighbors give each other. A slow, deliberate, side-to-side motion, like someone who had just learned what waving meant but didn't quite understand why. I stepped away from the window. "Nope," I muttered under my breath. "This isn't happening." I grabbed my phone again and opened the camera app. If someone was inside that house, I needed proof. Something to show the police. Something that proved I wasn't imagining this. I stepped out onto my porch. Cold night air rushed against my face. The entire street was silent. No cars, no dogs barking, just the distant sound of wind moving through the trees. Whitaker's house sat dark except for the one living room light. The front yard between us looked normal, just grass and a short wooden fence dividing the properties. I lifted my phone and zoomed the camera toward his window. The curtain had moved again. Now I could see directly into the living room. Whitaker stood there, still smiling, still staring straight at me. But there was something new now, something I hadn't noticed before. Another shadow behind him. At first, I thought it was just furniture, maybe the tall bookshelf he used to keep near the wall. But then the shadow moved, slowly, sliding across the floor and stopping directly behind Whitaker. The shape was taller than him, much taller, and thinner, too thin, like a silhouette made of stretched darkness. Whitaker didn't react. He didn't turn around. He just kept staring at me, smiling. My phone camera struggled to focus in the darkness. For a second, the image blurred. When it cleared again, Whitaker was gone. The spot where he had been standing was empty. The curtain shifted slightly, and the tall shadow behind him was gone too. I lowered the phone slowly. The entire living room window was completely still again. The light flickered once more, then turned off. The entire house went dark. My porch light buzzed softly overhead. I stood there in the cold, trying to slow my breathing, trying to convince myself I had misunderstood what I saw. Then I heard something behind me. 3 soft taps. Knock, knock, knock. I turned around slowly and felt the blood drain from my face, because the knocking wasn't coming from Whitaker's house anymore. It was coming from my front door. And when I looked at the door window, Whitaker was standing on my porch again, still smiling. But this time, he wasn't alone. There was someone standing behind him, something tall enough that its head didn't fit under the porch light, and its long shadow stretched across the door, right toward me. Exactly where he had been earlier. Same gray jacket, same hat, same thin, unsettling smile. But now there was something behind him, something tall, so tall its head remained hidden in the darkness above the porch light. The light flickered softly, casting a long shadow across the door. The shadow stretched over Whitaker's shoulders and across the glass panel beside the door. The shape of it made my stomach twist. It didn't look human, too thin, too long, like a body made of stretched limbs and angles. Whitaker knocked again, 3 taps. Knock, 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 the same slow rhythm. I stepped backward without realizing it. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "Mr. Whitaker?" I called out weakly. The man outside didn't answer. He just kept staring through the glass. Then his mouth moved, but the voice that came out didn't sound quite right. It sounded like Whitaker, but layered, like 2 voices speaking at the same time. "Ethan," he said softly. Hearing my name made my chest tighten. "What do you want?" I asked. Whitaker tilted his head slightly, the same strange motion I'd seen earlier in his house. Then he pointed slowly toward the empty house next door. His house. "The door," he said. "The door you didn't see." I frowned. "What are you talking about?" Whitaker's smile widened slightly. "The basement." My stomach dropped. Whitaker had once mentioned a basement in passing, a small one beneath his house, old concrete steps, low ceiling. He said the previous owner had used it as a storm shelter decades ago, but I had never actually seen it. Whitaker raised his hand again and knocked once more. Knock, knock, knock. Then the tall shadow behind him shifted. For the first time, the shape leaned forward slightly, and the porch light flickered again. When the light steadied, I saw part of it, a long arm, far too long to belong to a normal person. The fingers brushed lightly against Whitaker's shoulder. Whitaker didn't react. He didn't move. He just kept staring at me, smiling. "The door," he repeated softly. And then something strange happened. Whitaker's expression changed, just for a moment. His smile faded. His eyes shifted slightly, and for the first time since I had seen him, he blinked. Once. Quickly, like someone waking from a dream. "Ethan," he whispered, but this time the voice sounded different. Not layered, just him, weak, tired. "You shouldn't have let them in." My chest tightened. "What?" Whitaker's eyes widened slightly, like he was trying to say something else, but the shadow behind him moved again. The long arm tightened on his shoulder. Whitaker's smile returned instantly, too wide, too stiff, like someone pulling invisible strings. "They were waiting," he said, "for the door." A cold wind pushed against the front of the house. The porch light flickered harder now. The shadow behind Whitaker stretched across the glass again. I could see more of it this time. A tall frame, thin shoulders, and something where a face should have been. But the shape kept shifting in the darkness, never fully visible. Whitaker leaned closer to the glass, his breath fogged the window. They needed someone to open it. My throat felt dry. "What door?" Whitaker lifted one hand slowly and pointed again toward his house. "The basement door." My mind flashed back to something his daughter had mentioned at the funeral, a small detail I hadn't thought much about at the time. She said Whitaker had collapsed in his basement, late at night. She had found him the next morning, lying at the bottom of the stairs. The coroner ruled it a heart attack, but something Whitaker had said back then suddenly felt different now. They were already there. The porch light flickered violently. Whitaker's head jerked slightly to one side, like someone tugging a string. Then he knocked again. 3 taps. Knock, knock, knock. "The door," he whispered. "Open it." My chest tightened. "What open?" Whitaker's smile widened again, but the voice that came out this time wasn't his. It was deeper, colder, and it came from behind him. "We need another one." The shadow moved forward slightly, and for a brief second, the porch light revealed part of its face, or what should have been a face. Just a smooth stretch of darkness, no eyes, no mouth, no features at all. Whitaker tilted his head slowly, still smiling. Then he whispered one final sentence. "The basement door is open." And from somewhere inside Whitaker's empty house next door, I heard something move, something heavy, something slowly climbing the basement stairs toward the front door. I didn't sleep that night, not even for a second. After Whitaker spoke those last words, he stepped away from my door slowly. The tall shadow behind him seemed to glide backward with him, never fully leaving the darkness above the porch light. For a few seconds they just stood there, watching me, Whitaker still smiling. Then the porch light flickered again, and both of them were gone. Not walking away, not stepping off the porch, just gone. The porch outside my door was empty. The cold wind pushed lightly against the railing. The street was silent. I stood there for nearly a minute, staring through the glass, trying to convince myself that exhaustion or stress had finally caught up with me, but my hands were shaking too much for that explanation to feel convincing. Then I heard something else from the direction of Whitaker's house, a noise, a dull thump, like something heavy hitting the floor, followed by a slow dragging sound, something moving across the wood inside the house. I stepped away from the door and grabbed my phone again. Part of me wanted to call the police immediately, but another part of me kept thinking about what Whitaker had said. The basement door. They needed someone to open it. My porch camera notification chimed. Motion detected. I opened the camera feed. The image appeared on my screen. Whitaker's porch was visible from the angle. At first, everything looked normal. Dark windows, still trees, empty yard. Then, the front door of Whitaker's house slowly creaked open. No one appeared in the doorway. The door simply opened halfway and stopped. The inside of the house was completely black. And then, something moved. A shape slowly stepped into the doorway. It was tall, taller than Whitaker. Too thin to be a normal person. Its arms hung far below where elbows should have been. The porch camera struggled to focus in the darkness. The image flickered slightly. Then the figure leaned forward, and for one brief moment, the camera caught Whitaker standing behind it, still smiling, still staring directly at my house, like he was waiting for me to come outside. I locked my door, pulled the curtains closed, and called the police. The officers arrived about 20 minutes later. 2 patrol cars, flashing red and blue lights, spilling across the quiet street. By the time they knocked on my door, Whitaker's house was dark again. The front door was closed. Everything looked normal. Too normal. I told them everything. The knocking, Whitaker on my porch, the shadow behind him, the figure in the doorway. They exchanged a look that told me they already had their own explanation. Stress, grief, a vivid imagination. But one of the officers agreed to check the house anyway, just to be safe. We walked across the yard together. The grass between our houses was damp with dew, but there were no footprints. Not mine, not Whitaker's, nothing. The officer knocked on the front door. No answer. He tried the handle. The door was unlocked. The house smelled stale when we stepped inside, like old dust and cold air. The living room looked exactly the same as it had the day Whitaker's daughter left. Furniture in place, curtains drawn, no lights on. But the officer noticed something immediately. The basement door. It stood open, just slightly. At the end of the hallway, a narrow staircase led down into darkness. The officer shined his flashlight toward the steps. "Sir, did you come inside this house tonight?" he asked. "No. Are you sure?" I nodded. The beam of the flashlight slowly moved down the stairs. Concrete walls, old wooden railing, the bottom of the basement floor just barely visible. And then the officer froze. His flashlight stopped moving. "What is it?" the second officer asked. The first officer didn't answer right away. Then he said something quietly, something that made my chest tighten. "There are footprints." We all stepped closer. The flashlight beam moved slowly along the basement floor. Clear marks in the dust. Footprints. But they weren't coming up the stairs. They were leading down, as if someone had walked into the basement recently and never came back up. The officer descended halfway down the steps, shining the light across the floor. The beam stopped on something near the back wall, something lying on the concrete. The officer crouched down. Then he stood up slowly and turned toward us. His face had gone pale. "There's another door down here," he said, "behind the furnace." The second officer frowned. "What kind of door?" The first officer swallowed. "I don't know." He shined the flashlight deeper into the basement. The beam revealed an old metal door built into the far wall, thick, rusty, with a large latch hanging open. The officer stepped closer to it. The flashlight beam drifted inside, and for a moment we all heard something. A sound, very faint, coming from somewhere beyond the doorway. 3 slow taps. Knock. 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 The officer immediately slammed the metal door shut, locked the latch, and backed away. No one spoke for several seconds. Then we all heard it again from the other side of the metal door. Knock. 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 Slow, even, exactly the same rhythm I had heard on my front door earlier that night. The police sealed Whitaker's house the next morning. They said the metal door led to an old storm tunnel system built decades ago, abandoned, collapsed in most places, too dangerous to explore. Officially, nothing else was found. But 3 days later, another house on our street called the police. A woman reported someone knocking on her door in the middle of the night. 3 taps. Slow. Even. When she looked through the door camera, she saw a man standing on her porch, gray jacket, baseball cap, smiling faintly. And when she asked who it was, the man outside leaned closer to the camera and whispered one sentence: "Have you opened the basement door yet?" If you ever hear someone knocking late at night and the rhythm sounds like this: knock, 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 make sure you check who's outside, because sometimes the thing knocking isn't the one waiting at the door. Sometimes it's the thing underneath your house, waiting for someone to let it out.